All right, everyone. Welcome, welcome. Um, I want to first of all thank you for being on this in this class. Some of you have been with me now for a couple of years, and it's been live for a few years, and this is Zoom. But in the middle session, we always have a fall session, a winter session, and a spring session of classes. In the winter session, for the past couple of years, I've always pushed myself to teach a book of the Tanakh, of the Bible, that we don't normally study, certainly not in depth. So 2 years ago, we studied Psalms. Last year, we studied Proverbs. And this year, we are going to try and tackle the book of Job. It is not an easy book at all. In terms of its theology and the questions that it asks and those sorts of things. And it's quite a long book. We'll talk about that. We're obviously not going to read the whole thing, but I will let you know today if you'd like to get copies of it. I'll give you some suggestions on where to get copies and which copies to get. It's 42 chapters, I think, beginning to end, and it's quite an involved book. So we're going to be looking at pieces of it and asking some really big questions. So let's start. We have more than I can see on one screen. So let me just remind people, if you would like to ask a question, first of all, everybody is muted. If you'd like to ask a question, you can go to your, on the bottom, it'll say reactions. And some of you, if you have an older version, it'll be in participants. There'll be a button that says raise hand. If you do that, a little hand will pop up on your box and it'll put you actually to the top of my screen, and I'll see you there and I'll be able to say, oh, I see you, and you can ask your question. If you go like this, I may not be able to see you, because if you're not on the screen I'm looking at, I won't see you. So you have to really try to do that. If for whatever reason you can't find that and I still don't see you and you really have a question, either chat it or unmute yourself. And I'm happy to try and answer whatever questions come up as we go. All right? Off we go. So the syllabus of this class, it's 5 sessions that we're going to be doing, 5 Tuesdays. Today is going to be a welcome and introduction. We're actually going to dive into some text today. Then we're going to have 2 sessions where we're really looking at text. And we are going to look at it, the original text, and I will bring commentary and rabbinic texts when I feel like it really enriches our conversation on those texts. But we're going to spend 2.5 sessions really focusing just on getting a taste of what the text of the book of Job is. Then we're going to focus 1 session on Satan, because I know that if I don't, we're going to want to, right? We're going to see Satan already today, Hasatan. And so if we ask questions, if you have questions about Satan, no, we're going to spend an entire session on the Jewish view of Satan. First of all, the Job view of Satan, then the Jewish view of Satan, frankly, which comes from Job mainly, and a couple of different other biblical texts. And then a little bit of a comparison between the Jewish understanding of Satan and a Christian understanding of Satan. Because I think we live in a Christian world. When we hear the word Satan, that's what goes into our heads, right? This guy all in red with the horns and the pitchfork and all that. That's not the Jewish view of it. So we need to have that comparison. And then finally, on March 9th, the last, we're going to try to wrap up, and we're going to ask the question, so what do we learn as Jews from this book? That's our overall overarching syllabus for this class. Questions on that? So the other thing, I don't usually do this, but for this class, I found instead of not just the syllabus, it's important that we sort of lay out what are the themes that we're going to be looking at and talking about throughout the course of this class. It's almost like these are the things I want you to keep in your mind as we're going through the text this week and the next 2 weeks, right? So First of all, Job has a very unique style and structure. And we're going to be exposed to that. We're going to learn about that. It has a different rhythm and feel and flavor and tone than just about any other book in the Bible. We're going to talk at the end, about what the role that this book has within Jewish tradition. We are going to be talking about the concept of theodicy, not the Odyssey, which is a wonderful work by Homer, right? But theodicy, which is the philosophical term for the problem of evil. That is what the book of Job deals with. The problem of evil. And the technical philosophical term for that is theodicy, with a focus on why good people suffer. There's a lot of evil, a lot of bad things that happen in this world, but we're going to see Job is going to elevate this question of good people suffering to a whole new realm. We're going to talk about the role of Satan and the nature of God as part of this. And the other question I kind of want you to keep on your mind as we go through this is this book a book about God, or is this book a book about humanity? So these are sort of the questions that we're going to deal with, some of them directly in the wrap-up and conclusion, some of them sprinkled throughout as we go. So let's kind of do a little bit of a history, just so we know what we're talking about here. The book of Job is part of the third section of the Hebrew Bible. For those who are unfamiliar with the sections, it's divided into three. The first is Torah, the 5 books of Moses. The second in Hebrew is called Nevi'im, which are the prophets, Isaiah, Ezekiel, Jeremiah, Judges, Joshua, right? That whole section. And the last is Ketuvim, or writings. And that is where the book of Job falls. It is also where Proverbs and Psalms fall. So you can see, it's been sort of intentional, by the way. My focus has been Ketuvim, has been the book of writings in these winter sessions for a couple of different reasons. One, Torah we go through every year, all the time. I speak about it every Shabbat. You want to learn about my views on that? Come listen to me on Shabbat. And Nevi'im, the prophets, twofold. One, we do learn some of them during the Haftarot. But I also find Ketuvim much more interesting, personally. And so I like to teach what I enjoy. Michael Frank asks the question, does Ecclesiastes not touch on the futility of being observant and belief in God? It touches on it, Mike, but it's not its main focus. It's not its main focus. Certainly not like what we're going to see here. And Ecclesiastes is more just on futility in general, right? As opposed to this really is on good people suffering. And why do bad things happen to good people? But it's a good question, Mike. All right. Got to go back here. Now, the Talmud tells us that this was written by Moses. Okay? And Peter, I'm answering your question right now. The Talmud tells us it was written by Moses, which would put it approximately at 1300 BCE. Exodus, they say, is around 1290, somewhere around that area, right? Scholars, however, don't believe that Moses wrote the book of Job. They don't know who actually wrote it. It's not a named or attributed book other than to Moses, but they do believe that it was written somewhere between the 7th and 4th century BCE. It is mostly written in Hebrew. There may be a couple of Aramaic phrases in there, but it's really the language of its origin is Hebrew, of what it was written in. Now, even though it was written, between the 7th and the 4th century, it wasn't actually canonized into the Bible as part of our biblical books until the 2nd century CE, right? Because it was the rabbis that put together the Ketuvim, the Bible, the writings, and the writings were the last to be put together. It's likely that the biblical canon was finalized right after the Babylonian exile for the Torah, a little bit later for the Nevi'im, for the prophets, and Ketuvim was the last to be put together. So it's the latest. What are we going to see when we get in there? And I'm trying to give you the 60,000 foot first because we are going to get into the weeds. And once we do that, it's going to be hard to pull back. So I want to sort of give you all of that first. Structure. There are actually distinct sections of the book of Job. The first 2 chapters are prose, and it is called the prologue. We're going to be looking at chapter 1 today, probably a little bit of chapter 2 next week, as well as other things. Then chapter 3 is what's known as Job's first monologue. There's a couple of monologues here. This is his first, and it really takes up all of chapter 3. Then we have a very large section of dialogues between Job and his friends. There are actually 3 distinct dialogues, and we can kind of divide it up into 3 larger groups. But as you see, it goes from chapter 4 to chapter 27. It's a lot of text. So we're not going to obviously read all of this, but I will bring you'll get a flavor of it. You can see kind of what it's like. Then after those dialogues, we get what are called the 3 monologues. And one of them is by Job, and there are other monologues, the 2 other monologues that are there as well. That goes from chapter 28 to 37. Then we get some speeches by God. God gets to respond, and Job gets to respond to that as well. Chapter 38 to 42. And then we finally have the epilogue, the finale, which really is only the last part of chapter 42. Mike Derschlag asked, was Job written by multiple individuals and over what period of time? It is actually unknown. Job is the authorship of Job is really quite a mystery, and that's why they have such a wide range of when they think it may have been written, and they do that not because they have any empirical evidence of that, but because they're analyzing the dialect and the language, right? And then they say it seems to fit within this time period, but they really don't know more than that, Mike. So it's a good question. Okay. Where to find it, right? If you do not have a good English translation of the Hebrew Bible, it is a must for every Jewish household. The one I recommend is JPS, Jewish Publication Society's Tanakh, the Holy Scriptures. This was actually written in, I think 1985 is when it was published. It wasn't written then, it was published then. But the words have been the same pretty much all the way through. I like it because it is a modern English translation of the entire Hebrew Bible. No these, thous, thys, right? It's just straightforward, almost literalist. And you'll see, sometimes it'll even put a footnote saying meaning of Hebrew uncertain, because they just don't know. So they take a guess. We don't exactly know. But if you are looking for a good English translation of the entire Hebrew Bible, this is where I would go, right? If you have the red Chumash, which I have right here, right? The one we use, Eitz Chaim, at services, this is not the entire Hebrew Bible. This is going to be the entire Torah and just the prophets that are used as haftarot as part of our scriptural reading. But there's actually a lot more that isn't read in the synagogue, and this is where you want to go to get that. If, however, you are very interested in the book of Job itself and would like accurate translations, commentaries on the book, Judy is asking, is this the Tanakh our students receive? Yes, it is. It looks a little bit different though, but yes, it is. That one has the Hebrew. This one is just English. Elisheva, hold yours up again for those who can see it. Hold on. I will spotlight for everyone, right? Everyone should be able to see Elisheva now, right? And yeah, the Cullies have it too. That's the same one. It's the same English translation. The only difference is that it has the Hebrew as well. Okay. If you're looking for a commentary and explanation and translation of the book of Job, there are really two that are out there that are excellent. And I actually have both of them, and I've been using both of them to prep for this class. Both of them are teachers of mine. One is by Edward Greenstein, called A New Translation, Job, A New Translation. And the other is by one of my teachers, Raymond Shinlin, The Book of Job. These are both excellent. I have them sitting right here in front of me. Let's say, however, you're interested in the book of Job, but you don't want to go and you don't want to buy one, and you don't necessarily know if you're going to want to have it all, taking up room on your shelf. We are now in the digital age, and I will recommend Sefaria.org. For those who do not know about Sefaria, you have to go and check it out. Sefaria is basically an entire Jewish library of any book you could possibly imagine at your fingertips. Many of them are not translated. So if you don't know Hebrew, it's going to be a bit of a challenge, but a lot of them are. And I will admit to you, because I didn't want to retype all of this, I am taking the translation that I'm going to be putting up here for you from Sefaria. It's not always the best. So I may change the translation a little bit as we go through based on these two books. But I didn't want to have to retype everything because Sefaria had it all right there for me. It's got Bible, it's got Talmud, it's got, everything you could possibly imagine. It's there. All right. That's introduction. Are we ready to jump into some text? Any questions on what we've got before we do? I kind of want to look through and see who's here. Hello, everyone. Okay. So let's start. What I really want to do today is take a look at chapter 1. I want to get us a taste. I didn't want to leave today without, we could have talked much more about history and structure and themes and all of that, but I really want to get into the text. So we're going to look at chapter 1 today, and I'm going to bring a little bit of rabbinic commentary just so we get a sense of what's going to happen over the next 2 weeks or 3 weeks after this, okay? Prologue. We're going to kind of divide it up into different sections. We're going to start with the very, very beginning of Job. I am going to ask for volunteers. I'll look at the screen I have here. If you really feel like you want to volunteer, you can pop your hand up, and I'm happy to let you read. Otherwise, Michael, I pick on you all the time in Beit Midrash, and I know you like to read, Frank. So I'll let you start.
Job 1 verses 1 to 4. There was a man in the land of Uz named Job. That man was blameless and upright. He feared God and shunned evil. 7 sons and 3 daughters were born to him. His possessions were 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels, 500 yoke of oxen, and 500 she-asses, and a very large household. That man was wealthier than anyone in the East.
All right. It sounds like the opening to any good novel, right? Let's introduce our character. Let's get a sense of who this character is, right? what do we learn about Job? What do we know about Job from these first three, actually should be four, the three or four verses? What do we know?
He's a rich man.
He's a rich man, right? He doesn't have to sing like Tevye. He is a rich man. And, numbers in the Bible, it's always very interesting, right? 7 is always an important number. 3 is always an important number. We see the parallelism between the 7 sons and 3 daughters and the 7,000 sheep and 3,000 camels. What this indicates is that this isn't a historical document. They're painting a picture here, right? Do we believe he really had 7,000 sheep? And probably not. But they're trying to build the parallelism. They're trying to build the imagery that this man, and it says here, was wealthier than anybody else. He had it good. He had it good. Okay? There's a few verses in between that just continue to say how good he had it, but I want to go on to the next section here. Mike Derschlag, do you want to read?
What section are you on?
Sorry.
I don't see any shared screen.
Sorry.
Are you
No, I
sharing
just
a
had a
screen?
You guys don't see it? Hold on. Wait.
I don't have a shared screen
I
here.
see it. It's there.
Hold on. Wait 1 second. It should say Job 1:6-13.
Yes, that's what I see.
I don't see that at all. I
Did you
I have pictures and I have the spotlighted speaker. Hold on. I switched to screen share. I got it
There
now.
you go.
Go ahead.
All right.
I'm sorry.
No worries. It's late where you are, Peter. You're on the East Coast. We'll give you a little break.
No, I went up and just got my JPS out myself. So
No worries. All right, Mike, go ahead. Verse 6.
Okay. One day the divine beings presented themselves before the Lord, and the adversary came along with them. The Lord said to the adversary, "Where have you been?" The adversary answered the Lord, "I've been roaming all over the earth." The Lord said to the adversary, "Have you noticed my servant Job? There is no one like him on earth, a blameless and upright man who fears God and shuns evil." The adversary answered the Lord, "Does Job not have a good reason to fear God? Why, it is you who have fenced him round, him and his household and all that he has. You have blessed his efforts so that his possessions spread out in the land. But lay your hand upon all that he has, and he will surely blaspheme you to your face." The Lord replied to the adversary, "See, all that he has is in your power. Only do not lay a hand on him." The adversary departed from the presence of the Lord.
Okay. Now, if I'm being honest, we could probably spend the next 5 weeks just on these verses, right? This is very rich, very troubling, very complicated, what is going on here, right? And so I want to take it apart a little bit piece by piece because it's important. And this is where translations are going to be important, okay? So we have here divine beings. We also have here the adversary, okay? So the adversary with a capital A is how this text is translating Hasatan or Satan. So when we see the adversary in the Hebrew, it says Hasatan. And most of the other translations, so Greenstein's translation just translates it as the Satan. And in Shinlin's translation, he translated it as the accuser. Okay? Adversary, accuser, Satan. All of these are going to be important when we talk about Satan and the Jewish view of Satan. Right? The challenge in translating it is part of our issue and will shape how we think about it. But I also want to start with, who are these divine beings? Right? I mean, we know about God. So what is the Hebrew that is being translated here? It's actually B'nai Elohim. B'nai Elohim, which Greenstein tries to translate. Greenstein tends to translate these as accurately as he can. So he's the one that translated Satan as Satan. And this he translates as the son of Elohim, Elohim being a name of God. But Shinlin translates this as lesser gods. B'nai Elohim, lesser gods. So as you can well imagine, the rabbis are going to really be struggling to figure out, who are we talking about here? Most of them say what we're talking about here are the angels. This is the way that the book of Job refers to the angels, divine beings, B'nai Elohim, children of God, so to speak. Now, Tom and David, Tom said the Stone Edition translates them as angels. Exactly, because the Stone Edition is following the rabbinic view on that in terms of that translation. So let me start by saying, Peter, I see your hand up, I'll get you 1 second. Let me start by saying that please understand, translation is already the first layer of interpretation. Really, the only way to understand the text is in its original. If you want to know what the author really intended, right? Each of us has to look at it. It's the same thing. I can look at a picture of a Monet, but I'm not really going to get the subtleties of the colors, right? If I look at a camera, if I look at it online, if I'm standing in front of it, I'm going to get a very different experience. Once it's being filtered through something else, we have to understand the filter. And so we have to understand our translators. Peter, go ahead with your question.
I always have a hard time with the different names of God, and whether it's Elohim or whether it's Yod He Vav He, but in some parts of the Tanakh, I find like they're saying that there are many gods and our God is just the God for us. Is that what this is doing, or is it a very different flavor?
No. So, there is another time, and Greenstein brings it up, there is another time where B'nai Elohim actually is used. If you look at Genesis chapter 6, 1-4, it actually uses this term B'nai Elohim. And the rabbis, by the way, struggle with what's going on there as well. It's come to, they say sort of fallen, not fallen angels, but an intermixing of angels and human beings created these B'nai Elohim. It's very confusing. The issue that you're bringing up, Peter, of multiple names of God, that obviously is throughout our text. Depending on how you understand it, the rabbinic view of that is these represent different aspects of God, and therefore, or different faces almost of God. And so, one name represents the aspect of judgment and justice. The other represents the aspect of mercy. And depending on which you're hearing from, may change the way that you see God. That's the traditional rabbinic.
But it's not different gods. It's just
No.
different attributes of the same divine being.
Correct.
Okay. Sorry.
No worries. No, that was a good question. All right. So we've talked about divine beings. We've talked about the adversary. Now let's talk about what it actually is saying here. Michael Frank asked a question, is the translation of divine beings become a precursor for Christianity? I don't think so in this case. Actually, we'll have an interesting conversation about Christianity sees the book of Job as a template for the suffering servant. And so Christianity uses the book of Job in that way, but I don't think it's connected to the divine beings directly that way. What's going on here, right? We sort of see God and Satan. I kind of have this this picture that they're like in a bar having a beer, right? And they start bragging about, what's going on. And God says, God asked Satan, where you been? Oh, I've been here and there, roaming all about. God says, have you seen Job? Isn't he the best? Right? And Satan's going, not so good. I've seen better. So that's part of the tone that we see here. Then underneath that now, we see this whole layer of, wow, we've got, for as much as Einstein says that God doesn't roll dice with the universe, we kind of see that happening a little bit here, right? Like God is basically saying, all right, do what you want with him. What do I care? And from a theological perspective, this begins our problems with the theology of Job. Not only are we going to have to figure out why do bad things happen to good people, but this in our faces says God is allowing it to happen, right? In Christianity, because the duality of Satan and God, right? Not duality, but the dualism, right? The opposition, they're separate. God represents good, Satan represents evil. Satan is there to undo what God is trying to do from a Christian perspective. It makes it pretty easy from a theological point of view. But since we don't have that, since we're going to see that Satan cannot act outside of God's aegis, God has to be okay with it. And that then raises all sorts of theological flags for us. Nancy.
Well, there's a difference in the two parts of this sentence, and where he says all that he has is in your power. I think he's the references to Job's wealth, and the other part he says, do not lay a hand on him. So it's distinguishing between the person and the stuff.
Yes, and you're very correct, and that actually is going to change as things start to get worse and worse and worse to some degree, because Job is going to get ill and have pain and stuff like that as well. But basically, it starts at this layer. I mean, basically what this is saying here, we're going to see it in a second in some of the texts. What this is saying is, look, Satan is basically saying to God, yeah, he's got everything. Of course, he's going to be your biggest fan. But if he didn't have all this, he'd turn on you in a second. That's basically what Satan is saying here. And it starts, and Nancy, you're right. It starts very clearly as God is saying, okay, you can mess with his stuff, but don't mess with him. That's going to change. Mm-hmm. Let's look at a couple of the rabbinic verses on this, or rabbinic sources on this. Rashi. Let's see. Who do we have? Bob Stein, you want to read? I know you like Rashi.
Happy to do it.
Go ahead.
Rashi on Job 1:6. Now the day came about. That day, which was Rosh Hashanah, known as the day of sounding the shofar, and the Holy One, blessed be he, commanded the adversary to bring the merit and the guilt of all creatures. This is the meaning of from going to and fro on the earth.
Okay. So let's take a look at what Rashi is doing here, because I can feel his discomfort, right? I can feel Rashi's discomfort. He has to explain this somehow. I want to come back, right? What he translates as now the day came about is one day. So that's our text right here, okay? So what is, according to Rashi, what is that one day? It's Rosh Hashanah. So what's Rashi doing here? He's saying this wasn't some random conversation in a bar like Rabbi Kornberg said it was, right? This is what's supposed to happen. Because everybody is supposed to be judged and weighed and pushed on Rosh Hashanah. And how do we know it's Rosh Hashanah? Because Satan said he was going about to and fro on the earth. Well, if he's the accuser or the adversary, we're going to see he's sort of the prosecuting attorney. Well, he's going to be busy on Rosh Hashanah. He's going to be going throughout the earth. As we stand asking for forgiveness, right? Satan is going to be holding up the ledger and saying, right? So Rashi is so uncomfortable. This is how I'm reading it. Rashi is so uncomfortable with this seemingly random, God says, sure, go ahead, right? That he's saying, no, what we can learn from this by the words on that day, it's kind of unique. It was Rosh Hashanah. What day is that day? It's Rosh Hashanah. And this is exactly what's supposed to be happening. So we see this first layer of the rabbis being uncomfortable with the theology of the book of Job. There actually was some discussion, and I tried to find where it was, and I couldn't find it for this class. I'll keep looking. But I know there was some discussion about whether or not the book of Job should even be in the Bible. Now, the rabbis were arguing back and forth. Maybe we shouldn't have it in there. It's we don't want people to read this. They're going to misunderstand. So that's Rashi. Okay.
That's why I asked you before about the Apocrypha text and how did this get canonized in our canon versus not Maccabees 1 and 2, which is more the real story of Hanukkah.
Right.
And they left all this stuff out.
Right.
There's so much other
ultimately, stuff. Yeah, ultimately it got canonized because the rabbis saw it through their lens as a strongly religious document, whereas they didn't see the book of Maccabees as a religious document. They saw it as a war record, ultimately. All right, let's continue. Now we're going to look at a text from the Talmud that is looking at our source as well. And we're going to see what the Talmud does with this. This is from the Masechet of Baba Batra. For those who study Talmud, you know that Baba Batra comes from the order of Nizikin, which deals with torts and laws, but this happens to be just a story that's in the midst of the text here. Let's see, Tom, you want to read? Nancy, I'll get you next time. I saw your hand go up afterwards.
Okay, it is okay. Baba Batra 15b. It is stated, now there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and the Satan came also among them. And the Lord said to the Satan, from where do you come? And the Satan answered the Lord and said, from going to and fro in the earth, and from walking through it. Job 1:6. The Satan said to God, Master of the universe, I have gone to and fro throughout the entire world, and I have not found anyone as faithful as your servant Abraham, to whom you said, arise, walk through the land in the length of it and in the breadth of it, for I will give it to you. Genesis 13:17. And even so, when he did not find a place to bury Sarah before he purchased a burial site for 400 silver shekels, he did not find fault with your ways or complain about the fact that you had failed to fulfill your promise.
Okay. So what is it that the Talmud is struggling with, right? If we go back to our original text, well, I'm going to just do it real quickly here. If we go back to our original text, it seems like, right, God, the adversary says, I've been roaming to and fro. And then God says, have you noticed my servant Job? That seems like a pretty big jump, right? Why would God do that? Well, when there's a jump in our biblical text, the midrashic text, the story text that we have of the rabbis, very often try to fill in that gap. And what they're saying is the gap is filled in by this comment from Satan. I've gone out and about, and I have not found anybody as good as Abraham was. Right? He did all these amazing things. If this is what Satan is saying to God, it makes sense for God then to say, have you seen my servant Job? It closes that gap in the text. And it makes some sense. Now, is that in the text? No. This is the rabbinic midrash, the rabbinic interpretation, struggling to make sense of what is going on here. Why is it that all of a sudden God is saying, have you seen Job? As a, this is no longer God who's bragging about Job. This is God involved in a conversation with Satan, and Satan saying nobody matches up to Abraham, and God's saying, well, Job's pretty good. Any comments on this? Or questions? Saul actually says, after the Akedah, you'd think that God was done with tests. The Akedah meaning the binding of Isaac. One would think, although Saul, you could also argue that the entire history of the Jewish people and God has been about tests. They never stop. In every generation, right? B'chol dor v'dor, we can say there's tests as we go. Michael, do you have a question? And then
Yes.
Mark's question.
The idea that God relies on some other divine being to evaluate human behavior, I never thought as mainstream Judaism. Is it?
So it's a much broader conversation, but I'll try to shorten it to say, okay, so what are angels, right? What are angels? We were just discussing them for those who were in my basic Judaism class. We were just discussing angels vis-a-vis Islam, because we were talking about a comparison between Judaism and Islam. And angels in Islam and angels in Christianity are sort of seen almost as independent beings.
Yeah.
In Judaism, angels are not seen as independent beings.
Right.
They are seen as an extension of the non-physical God into the physical world. It's the way God gets things done.
Okay.
Right?
Right.
So in essence, angels are part of the process. And part of the process of what God is still God that's doing it. God is judging. But the process that's set up is the Satan comes and says, here's all the things wrong. And then, either your soul, depending on the text or whatever, has to stand up and say, well, here's how I defend myself.
That's a lot of responsibility for an angel.
Yes. That's why they're angels and not humans. Marge.
So if Rosh Hashanah is the culmination of the year, of at least the religious year, isn't the implication maybe that this has been an ongoing conversation between God and Satan?
It could be. Yeah. I mean, it is an ongoing, it's an ongoing, this is, and Rivka sort of wrote to everyone, this is in fact Satan's job from a Jewish perspective. And we get it from here, right? Satan's job is to be the prosecuting attorney, the accuser. And we're going to see that in other texts as we go later on. Tom.
Yeah, I was just had a comment. It just seems that some of the theme that's coming up here is not just the idea of whether someone is a good person or a bad person who follows God or not, but also that there's a gratitude, because he's already the Satan is talking about Job. If you take all his stuff, he's not going to be so, be so favorable towards God anymore. And he's talking about Abraham and how he's not, he's not a kvetch, right? And Job seems like, I guess what he's trying to say is, without gratitude, the rest of it doesn't matter. You still have to have that. And that, I don't know, I'm just kind of picking that up right now.
Maybe. I mean, I think we may need to wait till the end to sort of see where all of this ends to get the final answer to your question, Tom, but I like the idea. All right, let's continue, because I want to make sure we finish at least what the text that I've got for today. One more rabbinic source. Nancy, did you want to read?
Sure. Malbim on Job 1:11. If he is really sincere, then even were he denied all his providential blessings, he would still continue in his righteous ways. If, on the other hand, his righteousness was in fact only instrumental, motivated by expectation of reward or avoidance of injury, then were the blessings removed, not only would he stop acting righteously, there being no good reason to do so any longer, but he would also curse God. For having previously believed his blessings to be deserved, i.e., that he had merited his wealth and possessions by virtue of his righteous ways, he would now blame their removal on the capriciousness of governance, declaring that God is not a just judge. This would clearly prove that his worship had not been out of love, for had it been so, he would not now complain, but would balance his good times against the bad.
Okay, so what we see here is the rabbis, the Malbim here, trying to explain the argument, not only the argument of Satan, right? Satan is basically saying, look, he's only praising you because he's got all these material possessions. But if you took those material possessions away, well, he frames it as, if he's really truly righteous, when you take all of it away, he'll still praise you. But more likely, we hear from Satan, right? More likely, not only is he going to stop acting righteously, but he's going to curse you, because everything that he thought that he got from you and he's praising you for, when you take away, he's going to curse you. So it's not just he's not going to praise you anymore, but he's actually going to curse you. And it talks about capriciousness. I mean, these are fancy words in English, but the Hebrew mirrors them. These this is the tone that the Malbim is taking here. All right. So I wanted to just give you a test or a taste of what, that's quite a Freudian slip for all the people that were that are listening, given what we're talking about. But I want to give you a taste of what we're going to be doing in terms of looking at some sections and then trying to see how the rabbis make some sort of sense of it. But I do want to go back to our text and finish up the first chapter, so we sort of see where it ends and where it's going. And so we're moving to Job 13 through 19, verses 13 through 19. Daveen, you wanna read?
Yeah. Job 1, 13 through 19. One day, as his sons and daughters were eating and drinking wine in the house of their eldest brother, a messenger came to Job and said, "The oxen were plowing and the she-asses were grazing alongside them, when Sabeans attacked them and carried them off and put the boys to the sword. I alone have escaped to tell you." This one was still speaking when another came and said, "God's fire fell from heaven, took hold of the sheep and the boys and burned them up. I alone have escaped to tell you." This one was still speaking when another came and said, "A Chaldean formation of 3 columns made a raid on the camels and carried them off and put the boys to the sword. I alone have escaped to tell you." This one was still speaking when another came and said, "Your sons and daughters were eating and drinking wine in the house of their eldest brother, when suddenly a mighty wind came from the wilderness. It struck the 4 corners of the house so that it collapsed upon the young people and they died. I alone have escaped to tell you."
Okay, so we see now what's happening, right? Satan has the ability to do what he wants, to take away property. It's interesting from a biblical perspective that sons and daughters are seen in this context as property, right? Because that's the end. Your sons and daughters were there, and they all died. But one after the next, and we get this beautiful, it's not poetic because this is still prose, and we're going to get to the poetry, but it's almost poetic in the way that it's being written. Just this wave upon wave of misfortune, that he hardly has a chance to cope with what one person is saying to him, and he gets hit with the next one. very powerful. And for anybody who's ever been in a situation where multiple things were going on at once, you know this feeling, and it's a horrible feeling, right? You really don't feel like you can catch your breath even. Peter?
You imagine, though, you're Jacob and Joseph is, Joseph is gone now. And now you're telling me that 7 children are getting wiped out in this instance. How, out of the 7 children, four of them lived through that? Or who's dying here?
At the end, it's his children are dying.
One after another.
Well, in the beginning, it's the boys. In other words, he was very wealthy. So he had servants out there watching his sheep and all these sorts of things. So when people came and stole the animals, they killed the servants. So when it says the boys were put to the sword, that's not his family, likely. It isn't until we get to verses 18 and 19 that it now is his family. Up until then, it's really just his property. And by the way, all the people watching him were killed. All right, so one after the next we get. Let's see how this chapter ends. Judy Spurley, you want to read?
Sure, I'll read. Okay. Then Job arose, tore his robe, cut off his hair, and threw himself on the ground and worshipped. He said, "Naked came I out of my mother's womb, and naked shall I return there. The Lord has given, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. For all that, Job did not sin, nor did he cast reproach on God."
All right. So what is Job's response? He worshiped. He did not sin. He ultimately said this phrase here, which we actually quote at funerals now. This is part of our liturgy at funerals. Adonai Natan v'Adonai lakach, Yehi Shem Adonai mevorach. The Lord has given, the Lord has taken, blessed be the name of the Lord, right? That's what we say at funerals in an effort to try and duplicate Job's piety, even in this most difficult moment. And this is where the first chapter ends. So we see the introduction, we see this deal between God and Satan. We see the first wave of misfortune hit Job, and it appears he is unshaken, right? He has not turned his back on God. He does not curse God. He does not, any of those things that Satan said he was going to do didn't happen. Now, this is chapter 1 out of 42. But it's the way it starts. It's the way it starts. And I wanted to make sure that today we gave that flavor of what's going to go on here and what the theological emotional setup is for this. And this is tough. This is tough. I mean, this is not the God I want to worship, looking at this chapter. So how do we, as Jews, right? How do we make sense of this? How do we look at it? We're going to see, and the rabbis are going to struggle with that. And the rabbis are going to come up with their answers. And hopefully by the end of this class, we'll come up with ours. If nothing else, then it challenges us as Jews to say, hey, we better ask the tough questions because they're out there. So I'll ask the question, is Job Jewish? So it doesn't say Yehudi, it doesn't say in the text that he's Jewish, but frankly, it doesn't say that about any of the prophets either, right? It doesn't say Isaiah's Jewish, doesn't say, right? It's just known that he's Jewish. The rabbis certainly say, yes, he's Jewish. Is there a possibility that we could argue he's not? And this is, yeah, I think you can, because it doesn't say it for sure, but then we'd have to challenge all of those texts, that don't say it explicitly. And most of them don't. All right. Let's see. Any questions or comments? We just have a few minutes. I actually timed this pretty well. I was afraid I was going to be way, way over on my time. I timed it pretty well. I will stop sharing the screen just so that I can see people a little bit better here. Any questions or concerns or comments or things that you just want to sort of stay at the outset? Again, we just are dipping our toes into this, but
we're going to be for the next 5 weeks, 4 weeks.
Say it again, Nancy.
How depressed are we going to be for the next 4 weeks?
Ironically, this isn't the most depressing book of the Bible. There are other ones, Lamentations being one of them. But this is a challenging book. We are going to be challenged these 5 weeks. We are going to be challenged these 5 weeks.
I went and checked the reference because I heard Dan Brown in the Da Vinci Code in my head, and it's a later piece of this. It's 3811 is the little box that Silas finds under the floor of the church. And it says, hitherto shall thou
until here you will go and no
further.
further. Yeah.
I didn't know what verse was on there until I just looked it up.
Which
But
is it? I'll make sure.
Woven into the story.
Yeah.
Brilliant.
Which verse is it? 38 what?
3811.
All right. I'll try to make sure that by the time we get to the end of it, we look at that verse because it's a great verse.
It was in my head after you started talking. I heard the same flavor, and I remembered that the box said Job on it, and I went and looked up what the reference was on it. It's 3811.
Saul is asking, is this the longest book outside of the Torah? It's not, but it's one of the longest. Isaiah, I believe, has like 50 chapters, 48, 50 chapters, something like that, maybe even a little over 50, but it is definitely one of the longest. It's definitely not Jonah that we can read, sitting there on Yom Kippur afternoon while we're all hungry, Awesome. Well, thank you guys. First of all, thank you all for joining this class. I really, really appreciate you spending some time with me over the next few weeks. And I hope we learn a lot and challenge ourselves quite a bit over the course of these few weeks. Once again, let me just say what I said at the beginning in case people didn't come on. If you log on more than maybe 5 minutes early, you may get an error message saying that the host is using the account. I am, in fact, because I'm teaching my basic Judaism class right before this. I will try to finish that class by 7:25 so that I can be here and open it up. But if not, just wait a couple minutes and try again, and you'll be able to come in. It is the same link all the way through the class. You don't have to change links.
Brilliant, though.
All right.
It really is. Good night.
Good night, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Good night.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Night.
Good night. Thank you,
You're welcome.
everybody.